She walked 8 miles through mud and frost to propose marriage to a man she'd never met. Not out of love, not out of desperation, but out of pure, cold calculation. Caleb Mercer hadn't spoken more than a dozen words to any living soul in 3 years. Evelyn Carter hadn't begged for anything in her entire life. Neither of them wanted this. Neither of them had a choice. What happened next on that frozen Montana homestead would test everything they thought they knew about pride, survival, and what a person is truly willing to sacrifice to keep from losing everything. If this story pulls you in, hit that like button and drop the name of your city in the comments. I want to see just how far this story travels. The sky over Silver Ridge that October was the color of a bruise, purple and gray and low, the kind of sky that promised nothing good. The aspens had already lost their leaves, stripped bare by an early wind that came off the Rockies like it had a grudge. The trails that connected the scattered homesteads of the valley had turned to mud, then frozen overnight into jagged ruts that could snap a horse's ankle if you weren't watching. Most people with any sense stayed close to their stoves. Evelyn Carter was not most people. She had been walking since before sunup, carrying a small leather satchel over one shoulder and wearing her father's old wool coat. Too big for her frame, the cuffs folded back twice to free her hands. Her boots were already soaked through at the toes. She didn't stop. She couldn't afford to in any sense of the word. The road to Caleb Mercer's homestead wasn't really a road. It was more of an understanding between the land and the people who crossed it. A narrow dirt path that wound around a frozen creek and climbed slightly before flattening out onto a broad, lonely plateau about 2 miles east of town. The cabin sat there like it had been dropped from a height and just happened to land upright. Small, dark-timbered, a single thread of smoke rising from the chimney. Evelyn stopped at the edge of the property and looked at it for a long moment. This is a bad idea, she thought. This is absolutely a bad idea. Then she kept walking. Caleb Mercer heard the knock on his door and didn't move for a good 10 seconds. He was sitting at his kitchen table, eating cold biscuits and looking at nothing in particular, which was how he spent most of his evenings. The knock came again, not timid, not aggressive, just deliberate. The kind of knock that meant someone was actually standing there and actually intended to be let in. He pushed back from the table, crossed the single room of the cabin in 4 strides, and opened the door. The woman standing on his porch was not what he expected. Not that he expected anything. He didn't get visitors. The last person who'd knocked on that door was old Deputy Harkins 3 months ago, telling him about a stray cow that turned out not to be his. Before that, nobody. She was younger than him by a fair stretch. Dark hair, wind-burned cheeks, gray eyes that didn't flinch when he opened the door. She was carrying a satchel and standing very straight, like she'd practiced standing that way in case she felt like doing something else. "Mr. Mercer," she said. Her voice was steady. He'd give her that. "My name is Evelyn Carter, John Carter's daughter. I don't know if you knew my father." Caleb leaned against the door frame. "I knew who he was." "Then you probably know he passed away in August." "I heard." "And you may have heard he left some debts." He looked at her for a moment. "I hadn't heard the particulars." "The particulars," she said, and her jaw tightened slightly, "are that my family stands to lose the property, the livestock, and most of what's left by spring, unless certain obligations are met before the new year." She paused. "I'm not here to ask for charity, Mr. Mercer. I want to be clear about that from the start." Caleb studied her. He was a big man, not tall exactly, but wide through the shoulders, with rough hands and a face that had been outdoors for so many years it had simply stopped registering surprise. His brown hair was going gray at the temples. He hadn't shaved in 4 or 5 days. He'd been meaning to. "You'd better come inside," he said. "What?" She sat across from him at the kitchen table and set the satchel on the floor by her feet. He poured water into a tin cup and set it in front of her without asking if she wanted it. She picked it up and drank. "I'll get to the point," she said. "Please. My family, my mother, and my 2 younger brothers need me to be married. Not for sentiment, for the law." She said it flat, matter of fact, like she was reading figures from a ledger. "There are debts my father signed under his name that the creditors can pursue through the estate. If I marry before January, certain assets transfer in a way that protects the house and the remaining land from immediate seizure. It's legal. It's documented. I've read every paper twice. Caleb set his own cup down. And you're coming to me. I've considered the situation carefully. I imagine you have. You're a widower. You've been alone out here for, she paused, calculating, 3 years. You have working land, but it's undermanaged. Your crops this past summer were about half what this soil should yield, and I know that because I've seen this valley's production records at the county office. She wasn't apologizing for knowing any of this. You need help. I need a legal arrangement that protects my family. I'm proposing that we each get what we need. There was a silence. Outside, the wind picked up, and something rattled against the side of the cabin. A loose board, probably. Caleb had been meaning to fix it since August. You're proposing marriage, he said. I'm proposing a partnership. Most people would call that the same thing. Most people would be wrong. She looked at him directly. I'm not asking you to love me, Mr. Mercer. I'm not asking for anything that isn't practical. I would work hard. I'm not delicate. I keep accounts better than most men I've met, and I know how to stretch resources through a hard winter. What I'm asking is that you give this a fair hearing before you throw me out. Caleb leaned back in his chair. It creaked under him. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. How'd you get out here? He asked. I walked? From town? My horse threw a shoe last week, and we can't afford the farrier yet. He let that sit there. 8 miles. Through this cold, through this mud, in boots that he could see were soaked through even from across the table. You want to know what I think? He said finally. I came all this way, she said. I'd appreciate it. I think you're proud as hell, and this is killing you. He said it without cruelty. I think you've been turning this over in your head for weeks, looking for any other way out, and there isn't one. And I think you rehearsed most of what you just said to me on the walk over. Evelyn's expression didn't change, but something moved behind her eyes, just briefly. Is that a no? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. He looked down at his hands, rough and calloused, splayed flat on the table. 3 years alone. 3 winters where the silence in this cabin had weight to it, had texture, where some nights it pressed down on him like something physical. It's not a no, he said. Yeah, there were conditions, of course. They spent 2 hours at that table, and Evelyn produced documents from her satchel, actual written notes organized neatly, with questions on one side and proposed terms on the other. Caleb had never seen anyone prepare for a conversation the way she had prepared for this one. She wanted it written down between them, privately, that this was a legal arrangement first, that they would live together and work together and present themselves to the community honestly as husband and wife, but that neither of them would make demands of the other that went beyond the requirements of the arrangement. She wanted it stated plainly that she was bringing her own worth to the table and not arriving as a charity case or a burden. You want to put your dignity in writing? Caleb said. I want us to understand each other, she said, from the beginning, before something gets assumed. Fair enough. He had conditions too, though he struggled to articulate them at first. He'd never been good with words. His late wife, Margaret, had always said he could go a whole week saying nothing and somehow still make her feel heard. He didn't know how that worked. He wasn't sure it still did. I don't want pretending, he said finally. If something's wrong, say it. If something isn't working, say that too. I'm past the age where I can tolerate someone suffering in silence and calling it peace. Evelyn nodded slowly. That's reasonable. And your mother and brothers, you said they need the house protected. Yes. They stay in their house. I'm not asking your family to move out here or change their lives because of this arrangement. That's your business, and I won't meddle in it. She looked at him for a moment, really looked at him, in a way she hadn't quite done before, like she was recalibrating something. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me yet, he said. Winter's got a long way to go, m'persant. They were married 11 days later in the county clerk's office in Silver Ridge. No church, no flowers, no reception. The witness was the clerk's assistant, a teenage boy named Roy, who kept looking out the window like he'd rather be somewhere else, which, to be honest, was how all 3 adults in the room also felt, though none of them said so. Evelyn wore her mother's brooch and her own gray dress. Caleb wore the same clothes he wore every day because he didn't have much else. They stood beside each other while the words were read, both looking at the clerk instead of at each other, and when it was done, they shook hands. Actually shook hands, right there in front of Roy, who blinked at this like he'd never seen anything stranger in his 14 years on Earth. Well, Caleb said outside on the steps. Well, Evelyn said, a long pause. I've got a supply run to do before we head back, he said. Hardware and flour. Shouldn't take more than an hour. I'll need to stop at the post office, she said, and I want to return a book to Mrs. Harmon. All right. All right. They went their separate ways for an hour and met back at his wagon, her wagon now, too, and drove the 2 miles to the homestead without exchanging more than a dozen words, which, for Caleb Mercer, was completely normal. For Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Mercer now, a name that still sat wrong in her mind, like a coat that didn't quite fit. It was the strangest hour of her life. The cabin had 1 bedroom and a loft. Caleb had moved his things to the loft without being asked. He hadn't mentioned it. She'd simply discovered it that first evening when she went to understand the layout of the place. She stood in the small bedroom, his bedroom, cleared now of everything except a bed frame, a straw mattress, and a single nail on the wall, and felt the full weight of what she'd done settle onto her. This was her life now, this cold, quiet, half-dark room. This man she didn't know. This arrangement held together by documents and stubbornness and a total absence of alternatives. She set her bag down on the floor and sat on the edge of the mattress and pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed. You chose this, she told herself. Now make it work. Bond. She made it work. Not gracefully, not at first. The first week was a series of small frictions. She reorganized the kitchen, and he couldn't find anything for 3 days and said nothing about it, which annoyed her more than if he'd complained. She tried to light the cook stove with green wood and filled the cabin with smoke and refused to ask for help, which annoyed him in a way he couldn't quite explain. He got up before dawn, and the noise woke her up, and she lay in the dark trying not to resent it. But there was a rhythm under the awkwardness. She could feel it trying to establish itself. She started waking up at first light, not because he asked her to, but because lying awake in the dark felt worse. She found his bookkeeping, the ledgers he kept for the farm, and discovered they were not so much ledgers as a pile of papers with numbers on them, organized by no system she could identify. She sat down at the kitchen table one morning with a cup of coffee and spread them out and started making sense of them. When he came in from the morning chores 2 hours later, she was still there, 3 columns of neat figures in front of her and a look of mild professional disgust on her face. What is this? She said, holding up a crumpled receipt. He looked at it. Seed corn. Last March. You overpaid by 40%. He was quiet for a moment. I know that. Do you know it because you calculated it, or because you could tell from the weight? Because I could tell from the weight. She looked at him. He looked at her. Then she smoothed the receipt out and added it to a stack. I'll set up a proper system, she said. All right? And next spring we buy from Miller, not from Hennessy. Hennessy is cheaper on paper. Hennessy is cheaper on paper, she agreed. Miller is cheaper when you count what you actually receive, which I will be calculating from now on. There was a pause. Something shifted in Caleb's expression. Not a smile exactly, but an acknowledgement. A small adjustment of his estimation of her, visible for just a second before his face went back to its usual stillness. Breakfast? He said. I already made it. It's on the stove. He looked at the covered pan on the stove, then back at her. I didn't hear you do that. I know, she said. Eat before it gets cold. None. The days shortened and the cold deepened. The valley turned iron gray and the mountains to the west disappeared behind cloud cover that settled in for weeks at a time. Caleb split wood every afternoon until his shoulders ached and stacked it along the south wall of the cabin. Evelyn rendered fat for the winter candles, patched a gap in the root cellar roof, and set up a proper inventory of their food stores that told them exactly, to the week, how long they could sustain themselves on what they had. The answer was long enough, but not with much margin. They talked about it one evening, sitting on opposite sides of the table with the inventory spread between them. This was how they talked now, at the table with something in front of them that gave the conversation a purpose. It was easier that way. Less like being 2 strangers in a room together, more like being 2 people working on the same problem. We need another 100 pounds of grain if we're going to carry the animals through March, Evelyn said. And I think we should trade 2 of the 3 young shoats for smoked pork rather than trying to winter them. Caleb studied the page. Harmon will trade, he said. He owes me from last summer. What does he owe you? I helped him rebuild his fence in August. He said he'd square it. Evelyn made a note. All right, what about the creek crossing, the south one? Is it solid enough for the wagon by December? He thought about it. Usually. Usually isn't a plan. No, he agreed. It isn't. She wrote something else. He watched her write it, the careful, deliberate way she formed each letter, pressing just slightly harder at the end of each stroke. His wife Margaret had written like that. Margaret had kept accounts too, in her own way, though hers had mostly involved quantities of flour and fabric and had been stored in her head rather than on paper. He hadn't thought about Margaret in a while. The thought came and went without the usual weight attached to it. He wasn't sure what that meant. Caleb, Evelyn said without looking up. This farm can do better than it's doing. The soil on the east slope is good, really good. Whoever last plowed it didn't go deep enough, but the composition is there. If we plant the right crop in the right place next spring, and I have the bookkeeping sorted so we're not bleeding money on supply costs. She paused and finally looked up. This could actually be something. Not just survival, something real. He looked at her across the table. The lamplight caught the angles of her face, all of them sharp, all of them tired. She'd been out in the cold all day, same as him, and her hands were chapped at the knuckles, and there were circles under her eyes that hadn't been there 3 weeks ago. But she was sitting here at 9 o'clock in the evening talking about the soil composition of his east slope like it was the most important thing in the world. You walked 8 miles to propose to a man you'd never met, he said. She blinked at the apparent non sequitur. Yes. That took something. A pause. I didn't have much of a choice. That's not what I said. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside the window, the wind pressed against the glass and the fire in the stove ticked and settled. I suppose it did, she said quietly. He nodded. Then he looked back at the inventory and pointed to a figure in the lower column. That number's wrong. You carried a 4 when it should be a 6. She looked where he was pointing and her brow creased. She erased it with the flat of her finger and wrote it again. Thank you, she said. Don't thank me, he said, almost exactly as he'd said it to her 11 days ago on the county clerk's steps. But the tone was different now, less warning, more something else. Something neither of them had a word for yet or weren't ready to use if they did. The stove ticked. The wind pushed at the glass. They kept working. Outside, the Montana winter settled in around the homestead like it intended to stay. Dark and heavy and indifferent, the way winters out here always were. Inside the small cabin on the plateau, 2 people who had each promised themselves they expected nothing sat together at a table with a lamp between them, and the light reached just far enough. November came in hard. The first real snow fell on a Tuesday, which Caleb noted only because Tuesdays were when he usually drove into Silver Ridge for whatever supplies couldn't wait. He stood on the porch that morning and watched the flakes come down thick and sideways and decided the supplies could wait after all. Behind him, through the cabin door he'd left cracked open, he could hear Evelyn moving around the kitchen. The scrape of the iron pan, the sound of her setting plates down with that particular careful efficiency she had, never loud, never careless, just deliberate in everything she did. He'd been married before. He knew what it was to share a space with someone. But this was different in ways he kept turning over in his mind without quite landing on the right words for it. With Margaret, the sharing had been natural from the start, grown up out of love and youth and the kind of blindness that love gives you when you're young enough not to know better. With Evelyn, every small accommodation was a conscious choice. She chose to leave his coffee on the stove when she made her own. He chose to stomp his boots clean on the porch step before coming inside because he'd noticed she didn't say anything about the mud, but she looked at it. These were not romantic gestures. They were something quieter and in some ways more deliberate than romance. He didn't examine it too closely. Examining things too closely had never done him much good. What he did know was that the farm was running better. Not dramatically better, not overnight miracle better, but in the small, measurable ways that actually meant something going into a Montana winter. Evelyn's inventory system had already caught 2 errors in their supply counts that would have left them short on lamp oil by February. She'd renegotiated the credit terms with Harmon's General Store, not aggressively, just calmly and with specific numbers, and gotten them 30 extra days on their account without Harmon even seeming to notice the conversation had been a negotiation. Caleb had watched that exchange from across the store and felt something he couldn't immediately name. Respect, maybe. Or the specific kind of surprise that comes from watching someone be very good at something you'd never thought to be good at yourself. She still frustrated him sometimes. She had opinions about everything and stated them without preamble, which Caleb found jarring, mostly because he'd spent 3 years in near total silence and his ears weren't used to it. She reorganized the tool shed in October, and the new system made more logical sense than his old one, but he kept reaching for things in the wrong place and catching himself cursing under his breath. She stayed up too late reading by lamplight, which burned through oil faster than he liked. And when he mentioned it, she looked at him with those gray eyes and said, very evenly, "I'll account for it in the inventory," which was not technically an argument, but somehow felt like one. But then there were other moments, small ones. One afternoon in early November, he came back from checking the fence line on the eastern slope and found her at the table with his late wife's old seed catalog spread open in front of her. He stopped just inside the door. The catalog was something he'd kept in the bottom drawer of the dresser for 3 years, hadn't opened, hadn't thrown away. Evelyn looked up immediately, and she must have seen something shift in his face because she said, "I found it in the dresser. I'm sorry. I should have asked before going through the drawers." "It's your dresser too," he said after a pause. She looked at the catalog, then back at him. "I wasn't reading it for sentiment. I was looking at the winter rye varieties. There's a strain here that does well in high altitude, and I wondered if anyone had tried it in this valley." He crossed the room and looked at the page she had open. She was right. The variety she was pointing to was different from what he'd always planted. Shorter growing season, more cold resistant. His neighbor Aldrich had complained for years about losing his rye crop in late-season frosts. "Your father teach you about seed varieties?" he asked. "My father taught me everything he thought I'd need," she said. He didn't anticipate needing to include much that was practical. There was something dry and not quite sad in how she said it. The tone of someone who'd made peace with a complicated truth without fully finishing the making. Caleb pulled up the chair across from her and looked at the catalog more carefully. They sat there for the better part of an hour, turning pages and talking through what might work on the east slope. It was the longest conversation they'd had that wasn't directly about a problem that needed solving. When Evelyn finally got up to start dinner, she didn't say anything about the hour they'd spent, and neither did he. But the catalog stayed on the table instead of going back in the drawer, and neither of them moved it. It was small. It was the kind of thing that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. The weeks continued to stack up. Caleb repaired the loose board on the side of the cabin, the one that had been rattling since August, since before Evelyn had arrived. He wasn't sure why he'd let it go so long. It took him 40 minutes. He didn't mention doing it, and she didn't mention noticing it done, but at dinner that night she said, out of nowhere, "It's quieter tonight." And he said, "Wind must have shifted." And that was that. She wrote to her mother every week, on Sunday evenings. He never read the letters, never asked about them. Once he came inside while she was writing, and she put her hand flat over the page in a reflex of privacy, and then seemed to catch herself doing it and lifted her hand again, and the gesture and the uncorrected gesture told him more about how she was navigating all of this than anything she'd said out loud. In early December, she developed a bad cough that lasted 10 days. Not dangerous, just persistent, wearing, the kind that kept her awake at night and made her voice rough by afternoon. She refused to slow down, and he didn't tell her to because he already knew that telling Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Mercer, to slow down was an efficient way to make her do the exact opposite. Instead, he made a broth every other evening with the dried herbs she'd hung in the kitchen in October, pushed the bowl across the table without comment, and went back to whatever he was doing. She drank it without comment. The cough eventually cleared. Neither of them made anything of it. This was how trust got built between people who were too proud to build it directly. Not through declarations or grand gestures, but through 100 small choices made quietly and without fanfare, each one adding its weight to something that was slowly becoming load-bearing. It was a Tuesday morning in the second week of December, sky iron clear and cold enough to make breathing hurt, when Victor Langford came to call. Caleb was out in the yard splitting wood when he heard the horses. 2 of them, well-fed animals with good tack, not the rough trail horses most people in the valley rode. He straightened up and set the axe head down on the splitting block and watched the 2 riders come up the path. The man in front was somewhere in his mid-50s, broad in the chest, with a gray coat that cost more than anything Caleb owned, and an expression of practiced pleasantness that sat on his face like a mask that had been worn long enough to almost look real. The man behind him was younger, harder, with pale eyes that moved over the property in a way that wasn't casual. The older man pulled up at the edge of the yard and tipped his hat. "Mr. Mercer, Victor Langford." He said his own name the way some men did. Like an introduction wasn't really necessary, like you should already know who he was and be grateful he was here. "I don't believe we've had the chance to meet formally. I've been operating in the valley going on 2 years now, but I confess I've kept mostly to my own operations." "I know who you are," Caleb said. He didn't move from beside the splitting block. Langford smiled. It was a good smile, practiced and warm, and it didn't reach his eyes at all. "Then you may have some sense of what I'd like to discuss with you." He looked around the homestead with an expression that managed to be simultaneously complimentary and slightly pitying. "You've got a fine piece of land here." "Fine piece of land. That creek crossing on the south boundary in particular. I imagine it's been useful to you." "It's been useful," Caleb agreed. "Yes." Langford paused, as though what he was about to say was something he'd only just thought of rather than the entire reason he'd ridden out here. "I'll get to the point, because I suspect you're a man who appreciates directness. My mining operation is expanding north. The water rights on that creek, and specifically the access at that south crossing, would be significant to my operation. And I'm prepared to offer you a fair price for the crossing rights. A very fair price." Caleb looked at him for a moment. "The crossing isn't for sale." Langford's smile stayed perfectly in place. "I haven't mentioned a figure yet. Doesn't matter. Mr. Mercer, the crossing feeds the east field and the livestock water in dry months. You dam it or divert it for mining, and I lose water access to a third of my property. Whatever you pay me once doesn't replace what I lose every year after." Caleb picked up the axe and turned back to the splitting block. "I appreciate you coming by." There was a silence. The younger man on the second horse hadn't moved or spoken, just kept his pale eyes moving over the yard. Caleb felt that gaze like a hand checking the locks on a door. "I understand your concern about water access," Langford said, and his voice was still pleasant, still warm, with just the first thin edge of something else underneath. "I want you to know I'm not an unreasonable man. There are arrangements that could protect your water rights while still allowing my operation to—" The cabin door opened. Evelyn came out onto the porch with her coat half-buttoned and a ledger under her arm, which meant she'd been working at the table and heard the horses. She looked at the two riders, then at Caleb, and read the shape of what was happening quickly enough that she didn't ask any unnecessary questions. "Mr. Langford," she said, as though she'd been expecting him. She hadn't, but she said it that way. Langford turned in his saddle and the smile reassembled itself. "Mrs. Mercer, I presume?" "Victor Langford. I was just speaking with your husband about a possible business arrangement." "I heard a little of it from inside." She came down off the porch steps and stood in the yard, close enough to Caleb that they made a unit without touching. "My husband said the crossing isn't for sale. That's our position." "Your position," Langford repeated with a slight and perfectly controlled emphasis on the "our" that managed to be patronizing without technically being offensive. "I respect that. I simply want to ensure that both of you have a full understanding of what I'm offering before—" "We have a full understanding," Evelyn said. "The crossing water feeds our east acreage from June through September. Mining operations on that creek would reduce flow volume by an amount that isn't recoverable through any compensation you could offer once. We know what it's worth to us. If you've done the same calculation for your own operation, then you know the number you need to offer doesn't make business sense for you either, which means we'd be negotiating over a gap that isn't going to close." She paused. "So, we appreciate you coming out." Langford looked at her. For just a moment, the pleasant mask slipped enough to show what was underneath it. Not anger exactly, but assessment, a recalculation. He looked from Evelyn to Caleb, and then back to Evelyn. "You've thought this through," he said. "We have," she said. He tipped his hat again, at her this time, not at Caleb, and turned his horse. The younger man followed without a word. They rode back down the path and didn't look back, and Caleb and Evelyn stood in the yard and watched them go. When they were out of earshot, Caleb said, "Mining operation." "I looked into it last month," she said. "When I was at the county office for the deed records, I saw his operations survey filing. They've been expanding north for 6 months. He looked at her sideways. You didn't mention it. I wasn't sure it would reach us. She looked down the path where the riders had gone. I'm sure now. They went back inside. Caleb poured 2 cups of coffee and set one at her place without thinking about it. She sat down and opened the ledger, but didn't write anything for a minute or so. He could see her thinking. He'll come back, she said. I know. Not with better numbers, with something else. Caleb drank his coffee. He knew she was right. He'd seen men like Langford before. Not many, but enough. Men who came politely the first time because politeness was cheaper than the alternative, and came differently the second time when politeness hadn't worked. The valley had a history of it, though mostly before Caleb's time. Disputes over grazing rights, water access, land boundaries that got settled in ways that people didn't talk about openly afterward. What does he actually need the crossing for? Caleb asked. She turned a page in the ledger and pointed to a rough sketch she'd drawn weeks ago. The valley from above, with the creek lines marked and the mine survey boundaries she'd noted from the county filing. If he expands north, the ore transport has to cross this watershed. There's only 2 practical crossings in this section of the valley. One is on Aldrich's land, and Aldrich's crossing has a gradient problem. It's too steep for heavy ore wagons. The other is ours. She traced the line with one finger. Without our crossing, his northern expansion either stalls or costs him a significant amount to engineer around. He needs this property's cooperation. He can't buy his way around the geography. Caleb studied the sketch. So we're a bottleneck. A very inconvenient one, she said, with something that was almost satisfaction. Not at the trouble they were in, but at having understood it precisely. He's not going to stop because we said no politely. No, she agreed. He's not. She closed the ledger and looked up at him. But he thinks we're just a farmer and his inconvenient wife. He's done the calculation on what it takes to outlast someone like that. And I don't think his calculation accounts for me, she said flatly. Caleb was quiet for a moment. He thought about her walking 8 miles through frozen mud to propose a business arrangement to a stranger. He thought about her spreading those ledger papers out on the table and building a system out of chaos in a week. He thought about her standing in the yard just now, coat half buttoned, ledger under her arm, talking water rights and survey filings to a man twice her age and 3 times her wealth without a single moment of visible uncertainty. No, he said. I don't think it does. Outside, the sky was doing what Montana skies did in December, piling gray upon gray until the light was just a suggestion. Caleb got up and put more wood in the stove. The cabin was small and the draft came in under the door, but the fire caught well and the heat spread out, and by evening it would be bearable in there, maybe even warm. He thought about what Langford's man had done with his eyes in the yard, scanning the outbuildings, the hay barn, the fence line, taking stock. It was the kind of look that had a specific purpose behind it, and Caleb had lived long enough in rough country to know what purpose that was. He didn't say anything about it that evening. There was no point in saying it yet when there was nothing to do with the saying. Instead, he banked the fire before bed and stood at the window for a moment looking out at the yard, the barn, the woodpile, the frozen ground under a thin skim of new snow, all of it still, all of it dark, all of it exactly as it should be. But he checked the barn latch twice before going up to the loft. December ground on the way. December did in that country, slow and pale and punishing. The cold wasn't dramatic, wasn't the kind that made for good stories. It was just relentless. It came every morning before dawn, and it stayed, and it took things from you 1 degree at a time, and you just had to keep replacing what it took, or eventually there'd be nothing left to replace. Caleb and Evelyn kept their routines. She kept the books and monitored the stores with the focus of someone who understood exactly how thin the margin was. He kept the animals fed and the infrastructure intact, and the wood split and stacked in quantities that other homesteaders in the valley couldn't quite match. Neighbors who came by, which wasn't often, but happened, noticed the difference. The Aldrich boy came by in mid-December to return a borrowed tool and stayed for coffee and looked around the place with the kind of unconscious inventory that people in that community always did, measuring survival prospects the way city people measured status. "You fixed the east fence," the boy said to Caleb. "Thought that section was a write-off." "My wife thought differently," Caleb said. The boy looked at Evelyn, who was measuring out grain rations at the far end of the room and hadn't looked up. "Your wife figured out the fence?" he said. "She figured out the cost of replacing a calf versus the cost of the wire," Caleb said. "I figured out the fence." Evelyn allowed herself exactly one small smile at the grain sack and otherwise maintained her professionalism. The Aldrich boy left, and Caleb came and stood near her while she finished the counting. "You could have let him think you fixed the fence too," he said. "I didn't fix the fence," she said. "It would have made you seem—" "I don't need to seem anything," she said, without heat. "I just need to be useful." He didn't answer that. The truth was he'd never met a woman, or many people, period, who held that particular line as cleanly as she did. Not performing usefulness, not performing capability, just doing the thing and moving to the next thing, and not waiting around to see if someone noticed. He noticed. He just wasn't entirely sure yet what to do with the noticing. Langford didn't come back in December. He didn't send anyone that they could see. He was simply quiet in the way that wasn't absence, the way of someone who was doing something elsewhere that you couldn't see yet but would eventually. January would come. The hardest part of the winter was still ahead. Caleb knew that. Evelyn knew that. They knew it about the weather, and they knew it, in a way neither of them said out loud, about Victor Langford. But the homestead was stocked, the animals were healthy, the books were balanced for the first time in years, and the two people who'd shaken hands on a courthouse step 6 weeks ago were sitting on opposite sides of a table on a cold December night with a lamp between them and work in front of them, and something, not quite comfort, not quite ease, but something in that direction, filling the quiet space where loneliness used to live. Evelyn turned a page. Caleb reached across the table and moved the lamp slightly closer to her side without being asked. She didn't say thank you. She just kept working. That was enough. The coldest week of the year arrived without warning, the way the worst things always do. It had been building for days. Caleb felt it in the way the animals behaved, the horses pressing close to the barn walls, the cattle standing with their backs to the north and their heads low, not moving more than they had to. The creek at the south crossing had frozen solid 2 weeks ahead of when it usually did, and the ice wasn't clear the way normal freeze ice was. It was white all the way through, which meant it went deep, which meant the cold wasn't going anywhere soon. By the second week of January, the temperature dropped far enough that the inside walls of the cabin developed a thin rime of frost in the corners each morning, even with the stove burning through the night. Evelyn stopped writing in the evenings because the ink thickened in the cold and dragged on the page. She started keeping the inkwell on the shelf above the stove instead, which helped, but then the shelf got too warm and the ink ran thin, and she had to find a middle distance between too cold and too hot that required moving the inkwell 3 times before she found the right spot, which annoyed her deeply and which she said nothing about beyond a single flat statement of, "The ink is impossible," one evening that wasn't directed at anyone in particular. Caleb added a second blanket to the loft. He didn't mention it to her. She'd added a second blanket to the bedroom 2 nights before and hadn't mentioned that either. The cold was something they were each managing privately and together at the same time, which was becoming a pattern in how they handled most things. They were 2 weeks into January. 14 days of temperatures that made every outdoor task take twice as long because your hands stopped cooperating after 10 minutes, when Caleb woke up on a Thursday night to a smell. He was a light sleeper. Had been since Margaret died, since the particular silence of grief had tuned his senses differently, made his body reluctant to go too deep into unconsciousness, because deep unconsciousness felt too much like not being present for whatever came next. He woke easily and often, and it had stopped bothering him. It was just how he was now. The smell came to him slowly, pulling him up out of a shallow sleep before he'd consciously identified it. Then his eyes were open, and he was sitting up, and he knew. Smoke. Not the familiar indoor smell of the cook stove or the fireplace. That had its own quality, controlled and close. This was outdoor smoke, cold air smoke, the smell of something burning that was not supposed to be burning, and it was coming from the wrong direction. He was down from the loft in 4 seconds flat, yanked his boots on without lacing them, grabbed his coat, hit the cabin door. The hay barn was on fire. The flames had started at the far end, the north end, and were working inward and upward with the quiet industriousness of fire in dry material, and the hay in that barn was very dry. 3 months of winter storage dry, and the wind was coming from the northwest, which was pushing the fire south and east toward the main body of the stored feed. The north wall was already gone. The roof at that end had collapsed. There was a column of smoke rising black and orange into the night sky, visible for miles in the flat winter dark. Evelyn. He didn't know if he shouted it or just said it. He turned back toward the cabin door. She was already there. She'd heard him come down from the loft, heard his boots on the floor, was standing in the doorway in her coat over her nightclothes, taking in the barn the same way he had. 1 second of stillness while her mind mapped it, and then she was moving. "The animals," she said. "I'll get them out. I need you on the waterline." "The pump will freeze. Bucket chain from the trough. The trough's under the lean-to. It might still be liquid in the center." He was already crossing the yard at a run. "Ring the bell if it gets to the main wall." She ran for the water trough without another word. What followed was the longest hour of Caleb Mercer's life, and he'd had some long hours. He got the 2 horses out first. They were the most likely to panic and the most valuable to lose. The gelding came without much trouble, just rolling whites of the eyes and snorting hard. But the mare had pressed herself into the far corner of her stall and wouldn't move until Caleb put his body against hers and physically walked her out 1 step at a time, his hand on her neck the whole way, talking steadily in the low, even voice he used with frightened animals because he'd learned a long time ago that tone was everything when something was scared. He got her out and tied both horses to the fence post at the far side of the yard, away from the smoke, and went back in for the cattle. 2 of the 3 cattle came out stumbling and slow, confused more than panicked. The third, a stubborn 2-year-old heifer that had given him trouble since the day he bought her, had somehow gotten herself tangled in the rope that tied her feed bucket to the post, and in her distress had twisted it tighter instead of loose. And Caleb was on his knees in the smoke and the heat cutting the rope with his knife, while his eyes streamed and the roof at the north end groaned and sent a shower of burning debris down 10 feet away from him. He got the heifer out. He got himself out right behind her, coughing and half blind from smoke, and stood in the cold air for a moment, just breathing. Evelyn was at the water trough with 2 buckets, hauling water that was slushy at the surface but still liquid in the center, as she'd predicted, and throwing it in long arcs at the base of the south wall. Not at the fire itself, which was well beyond 1 bucket's reach to suppress, but at the wall between the burning section and the storage area, trying to slow the advance. "How bad?" she said, without stopping. "North half is gone." He took one of the buckets from her. "We're not saving it. We're trying to save what's in the south storage. The feed. And the tools." He threw the bucket, and she'd already refilled hers and threw it, and they fell into a rhythm without discussing it. Fill, throw, working the south wall with the grim and focused efficiency of people who understood that they couldn't win this fight, but could determine how much they lost. The fire burned for 2 hours. At some point, Caleb didn't know when, time had gone unreliable. The Aldrich family appeared at the edge of the yard. The fire was visible from their homestead 2 miles north, and Thomas Aldrich and his 2 oldest sons had ridden over without being asked, because that was what people did out here when they saw a neighbor's barn burning. They joined the bucket line without a word of preamble, and the 4 of them together managed to soak the south wall thoroughly enough that when the fire finally ate through the center section and the roof came down in a long cascading crash of burning timber and ash, the south wall held. The stored feed in the south section survived, partially, maybe 60% of it, which was the difference between manageable and catastrophic. When it was over, when the fire had eaten everything it was going to eat and subsided into a sullen orange glow among the ruins of the north half, the 4 of them stood in the yard looking at what remained. The south wall of the barn was black and smoking. The north half didn't exist anymore, just a pile of collapsed burning timber, and the 3 stone posts that had held up the roof, still standing in the debris like markers at a grave. The smell was the particular smell of things that shouldn't have burned burning, scorched hay and hot metal, and something else underneath that Caleb had already noticed but hadn't said anything about yet. Thomas Aldrich put his hand on Caleb's shoulder for a moment. He was a big, quiet man, not much for words, which was maybe why he and Caleb had always gotten on well without ever being close. "You saved the feed," he said. "That was the thing to save." "Thanks to you," Caleb said. "We'll come back in the morning with the boys and help you clear what's left." He looked at Evelyn, who was standing at the edge of the yard with soot on her face and her coat scorched at one sleeve and her hair loose from whatever she'd had it tied back in. "You all right, Mrs. Mercer?" "Yes," she said. She was looking at the wreckage, not at him. "Thank you for coming." The Aldriches rode home. Caleb and Evelyn stood alone in the yard in the aftermath. It was maybe 3 in the morning. The cold had come back in hard now that the heat of the fire was gone, and Evelyn's breath came in short, visible clouds, and her hands around the empty bucket were white at the knuckles. "Come inside," Caleb said. "In a minute." He stopped. He could see she was looking at something specific, not at the wreckage overall, but at a particular spot near where the fire had started, at the base of the north wall. The part that was still structurally there, just barely, the section of wall framing that hadn't fully collapsed. "What are you looking at?" he said. She didn't answer immediately. She walked toward the ruined north end, close enough that the heat still coming off the debris made her stop at a certain distance. She stood there squinting into the orange glow. "Come back from there," he said sharply. She took one step back but kept looking. Then she turned around and came back to where he was standing, and her face in the dark was doing something complicated, working something through before she said it. "The fire started at the base of the north wall," she said. "Wind came from the north. Something in the wall ignited. There's no ignition source on that wall," she said. "You keep the lanterns on the south hooks. I've seen you check them every night before we come in. The north wall is stone at the base, and the first wooden beam is 7 feet up." She looked at him. "How does a fire start at the base of a stone wall in the middle of the night in the coldest week of the year with no lantern nearby?" He was quiet. "I smelled it," she said, "when I first came out, before the smoke got too thick." "Smelled what?" "Lamp oil," she said. "I smelled lamp oil." Caleb stood in the freezing dark with ash on his hands and the ruins of half his barn behind him and looked at his wife's face, and what he saw on it was not fear and not grief, and not the shock that a reasonable person might be forgiven for feeling in this moment. What he saw was the particular focused, cold-eyed clarity of someone who had just identified the problem precisely and was already thinking about what to do with it. "Don't touch anything over there tonight," he said finally. "I wasn't going to." "In the morning, before Aldrich's boys start clearing." "I know," she said. "I know, Caleb." They went inside. Evelyn put the kettle on the stove with hands that were shaking slightly. Not from fear, he thought, but from cold and exertion and the particular physical aftermath of an hour of sustained emergency. He put more wood in the stove and pulled the chairs close to it, and they sat there, both of them black with soot, both of them smelling of smoke, neither of them speaking for several minutes. He didn't sleep again that night. She didn't either. They sat by the stove until the gray light of early morning came through the window, and then he pulled on his coat and went back outside. He examined the north wall before the light got too bright and washed out the details. He took his time. He crouched at the base of the wall where the stone met the ground, and he looked, and he smelled, and he put 2 fingers against the stone and pressed. The stone was cold. Everything was cold. But at the base, in the soil compressed against the exterior of the wall, the ground was not frozen the way it should have been after weeks of deep cold. It was damp, oily damp. He pressed his fingers together and looked at them in the pale morning light and brought them to his nose. Lamp oil. He stood up. He looked down at the ground along the base of the north exterior wall and followed the irregular dark stain in the soil, partly hidden under a thin skim of snow that had fallen after the fire, visible only because he was looking for it. The stain ran for about 8 feet along the base, heaviest at the east corner. He crouched again at the east corner where the north wall met the fence line that ran toward the tree line 60 yards away. The ground near the fence post was disturbed in a way that wasn't fire damage, compressed and scraped in the pattern of boots, more than one pair, though the snow had softened it. He followed the line of the fence with his eyes toward the tree line. Evelyn appeared at his shoulder. He hadn't heard her come up. She was wearing his extra pair of work gloves over her own, because there hadn't been time last night to find hers, and she still had them on. "What did you find?" she said quietly. "What you thought," he said. He pointed at the stain at the base of the wall, then traced the line with his finger without touching anything. Poured along the base, started at the corner, and lit from outside. Someone knew the stone would hide how the fire started, that it would look like something in the wall went wrong. But they didn't know the oil would soak into the ground outside, she said. Or they didn't think it would matter. By the time anyone thought to look, the snow was supposed to cover it. He straightened up. Except you smelled it before the smoke overwhelmed everything else. She was quiet for a moment, looking at the ground. Then she looked toward the tree line. Can you track footprints in this? Some of it. Snow's soft enough. He looked at her. Go get the other pair of boots from the cabin. Your feet are going to freeze in those. My feet are fine. Evelyn. She looked at him. He looked back at her with the particular steadiness that was his version of being serious, which was different from how most people were serious, because it didn't involve any additional expression, just a kind of increased weight to whatever he was already doing with his face. She went and got the other boots. They tracked the path together, Caleb in front reading the ground, and Evelyn just behind making notes in a small book she'd stuck in her coat pocket, noting distances, directions, the spacing of footprints where they were legible, the way the trail moved. It went from the east corner of the barn along the fence line to the tree line, then turned north through the trees where the snow under the canopy had preserved the tracks better. 2 sets of boots, both men, from the stride and the weight, one set heavier than the other. The lighter set wore boots with a distinctive pattern on the outer heel, a small chip or crack in the sole that left a characteristic mark in the snow, like a nick in a coin. The tracks ran north for maybe a quarter mile through the trees before hitting the trail that connected Caleb's property to the main road. After that, on the frozen road surface, they vanished. Langford's operation is north, Evelyn said. I know. This trail runs north. I know that too. Caleb. She caught his arm lightly, and it was the first time she'd touched him that wasn't accidental, and they both noticed it, and she didn't let go immediately. We need to go to Sheriff Boone. He wasn't sure about that. He'd known Elias Boone for 10 years. Boone was a decent enough man, the kind of decent that meant he did what the law required and occasionally a little more, but who existed in a world where Victor Langford represented a lot of money, and money had a way of organizing the world around itself. Going to Boone with a story about lamp oil and footprints and a mining magnate wasn't going to produce immediate results. It might not produce any results at all. He said as much. I know, Evelyn said, but we still have to go. She looked at the place where the tracks ended at the road. Not because the sheriff will fix it, because if we don't report it, we don't have a record of reporting it, and we're going to need the record. He looked at her. You're already thinking further ahead than today. I have to be, she said simply. She took her notes out and wrote 3 more observations she'd made at the scene, quickly, in that careful handwriting of hers that pressed slightly harder at the end of each stroke. Then she closed the book and put it back in her coat. They went to town that afternoon in the wagon with Evelyn's notes and Caleb's account and a small cloth that Evelyn had pressed carefully against the oil-soaked ground outside the barn wall and sealed in a tin from the kitchen. Evidence was the word neither of them used out loud on the drive in, because saying the word made the situation something specific that was harder to pull back from. But the tin was in Evelyn's satchel, and the satchel was between her feet on the wagon floor, and they both knew what it was. Sheriff Elias Boone was a lean man in his late 40s with a drooping mustache and the eyes of someone who'd been doing this long enough to have seen most things at least twice. He listened to Caleb's account without interrupting, which was more than Caleb had expected. He listened to Evelyn's supplementary observations with the slight extra attention of a man who'd expected the wife to add sentiment and found her adding specifics instead. Lamp oil, he repeated. At the base of the north exterior wall, Evelyn said. I have a sample. She placed the tin on his desk. You can smell it clearly even now. I wrapped it within an hour of the fire going down. Boone opened the tin, sniffed it, and set it back on the desk. He looked at his own hands for a moment and then at Caleb. You're telling me someone deliberately burned your barn, he said. I'm telling you what the evidence says, Caleb said. You can draw your own conclusions. And you think? Boone paused. I think someone wants that property badly enough to start moving toward getting it, Caleb said. That's what I think. Boone was quiet. He tapped one finger on the desk slowly. He looked out the window at the main street of Silver Ridge, where, at this moment, at this time of day, there were probably 3 or 4 men who worked for Langford's operation running errands or conducting business, or just moving through the town the way money moves through a place, making itself felt without making itself obvious. I'll look into it, Boone said finally. We'd appreciate that, Evelyn said. Her tone was the one that said she was writing down what was promised and would be noting whether it was kept. Boone seemed to feel that, because he met her eyes and nodded with slightly more deliberateness than he'd used with Caleb. They drove home in the early dark, the temperature already dropping back to its nighttime cruelty. The horse's breath came in great white plumes, and the wagon wheels cracked against the frozen ruts, and neither of them spoke for a while. "Do you believe him?" Evelyn said eventually. "Boone?" Caleb thought about it honestly. "I believe he'll look into it. I'm not sure how far the looking goes." "Then we look too," she said. "That's what I was going to say." She turned and looked at him in the dark, briefly, with an expression he was getting better at reading. The one that meant she'd expected him to say something discouraging and was recalibrating because he hadn't. "We need to find out who those men were," she said. "The two who set the fire. Langford doesn't do his own dirty work. He hires it done and keeps distance. If we find the men, we find the connection." "The boot print with the notched heel," Caleb said. "Distinctive enough that someone who knows the area's working men might recognize it." "That's what I was thinking." She folded her hands in her lap. "I want to go back to the county office." "For the land records?" "For everything," she said. "Land records, survey filings, any claims he's made. If he was willing to burn a barn, he's done other things too. Possibly things that are written down somewhere that he thought nobody would look at carefully enough to understand." Caleb drove and thought about that. The horse moved steadily through the dark, and the cold pressed in from all sides, and the homestead, when it finally appeared ahead, looked smaller than usual and more fragile. The dark cabin, the ruined outline of the barn's north half, the smoke still rising faintly from the debris in the windless, frozen air. He pulled up to the porch and sat for a moment before getting down. "Evelyn," he said. She was already gathering her satchel. She paused. "I know what you're going to say," she said. "What am I going to say?" "That this is dangerous now. That it's different from a business dispute." She looked at him steadily. "That I should think carefully about how far I want to take this." "That's not what I was going to say." She waited. "I was going to say I'm glad you were here tonight," he said, "when the barn went. I'm glad you were here and not somewhere I had to worry about." She was quiet for a moment. Something moved across her face that she didn't try to manage or control, just let pass through. "I wasn't particularly useful at the bucket line," she said. "My arms gave out after 40 minutes. "You held for 40 minutes, he said, "and you smelled the lamp oil. That was luck." "No," he said. "Luck is finding something by accident. You smelled it because you were paying attention. That's different." She looked at him for a long moment in the dark. The cold was deep, and the night was vast and still, and the ruins of the barn sat behind them like a statement of what they were up against. "Thank you," she said quietly. Not the clipped, transactional thank you she used for small courtesies, something else. He nodded. They went inside. The fire in the stove had burned down to coals while they were in town. Caleb fed it back to life while Evelyn lit the lamp and spread her notes on the table and started writing up a full account of the day's evidence while the details were still precise in her mind. He watched her for a moment from across the room. The bent head, the moving pen, the absolute concentration, and felt something he couldn't name and didn't try to. He went and checked the latch on the cabin door, then the window latches. Then he sat down at the table across from her and pulled the supply ledger toward him, because there were calculations to make now. How far 60% of the stored feed actually stretched, what they'd need to source and from where, what they could afford and what they couldn't. Langford had taken half their hay barn. He'd done it on purpose and from safety, and with the expectation that a farmer and his inconvenient wife would look at the wreckage and decide that the crossing wasn't worth what came next. He'd miscalculated. Both of them knew it, sitting at the table in the lamplight with the wind pressing at the glass and the cold sitting on the cabin like weight. Neither of them said it out loud. They just kept working, side by side, the way they'd been doing since October, the way they intended to keep doing. The lamp burned steady, and the stove pushed back the cold, and outside the Montana night went on doing what it did, indifferent and immense. Inside the small cabin on the plateau, something that had started as a practical agreement was becoming something else entirely, though neither of them would have been able to say exactly when the change had begun, or precisely what to call what it was becoming. They stayed at the table until nearly midnight. Then Evelyn said goodnight, quietly, and went to the bedroom. Caleb banked the stove and went up to the loft. He lay in the dark for a long time before he slept, looking at the ceiling and listening to the silence and thinking about notched boot prints in fresh snow and the smell of lamp oil in the cold night air. In the morning, there would be a great deal to do. Sheriff Boone came out to the property 2 days after they'd filed the report, which was faster than Caleb had expected and slower than Evelyn had hoped. He walked the north wall, looked at the ground where the oil stain was, opened the tin Evelyn had given him and smelled it again, and studied the fence line toward the tree line without following it all the way through. He had the careful, non-committal manner of a man who was taking things seriously while being very deliberate about not saying so out loud. "I'll make inquiries," he said when he was done. "What kind of inquiries?" Evelyn asked. Boone looked at her with the mildly surprised expression that men sometimes got when she asked for specifics. He'd been doing it less than he had during their first meeting. She supposed that was progress. "Into the men who might have been in this area that night," he said. "Transient workers, new hires at the various operations in the valley, that kind of thing." "Langford's operation employs 30-some men," Evelyn said. "We're not suggesting it was a transient." "Mrs. Mercer," Boone said patiently, "I understand what you're suggesting. I'm telling you how an inquiry gets conducted without someone being able to say I'm conducting it improperly." He looked at her steadily. "Do you follow me?" She followed him. She didn't like it, but she followed him. Boone was telling her he already had a direction and was managing his approach carefully, which meant he wasn't entirely useless, just slow. She could work with slow if she had to. After Boone left, she sat at the table with what she'd already gathered and thought about what she still needed. The evidence from the fire was real and documented, but it was physical evidence without a human connection. Lamp oil in the ground, footprints in the snow, a tin in the sheriff's desk. It pointed toward deliberate arson. It didn't point legally to a specific person who had ordered it. Langford was insulated by the distance between himself and the men who did his work, and he'd been doing this long enough that the distance was probably well designed. She needed something written. She needed something written because written things didn't disappear the way memories did and couldn't be explained away the way physical evidence sometimes could by a man with good lawyers and a friendly judge. She needed paper with his name on it that said something it shouldn't. She'd had a thought about this since the morning after the fire, turning it over while she worked, checking it from different angles. Her father had taught her to read legal documents because he'd believed that the single greatest disadvantage of ordinary people in disputes with powerful ones was that they couldn't understand the paperwork. He'd sat with her at the kitchen table in the evenings when she was 12, 13, 14 years old, reading deeds and survey claims and county filings aloud, explaining what the language meant underneath the language. She'd hated it at the time. She'd wanted to be reading novels. She was grateful for it now in a way that sat in her chest with a complicated weight. The county office kept records of all land claims, survey filings, boundary adjustments, and deed transfers within the territory. She'd been to that office several times since arriving in the valley. For her own family's documents, then for the Mercer homestead's records, then for Langford's operations survey filings when she'd first noticed his expansion north. She knew the layout of the records room. She knew the clerk, a thin, nervous man named Stills, who smelled of paper dust and took his organizational responsibilities very seriously. She knew something else, too. When she'd looked at Langford's survey filings in November, she'd seen them quickly and for a specific purpose, to understand the direction of his expansion. She hadn't looked at them carefully. She hadn't looked at the boundary descriptions in relation to the existing deed records for the properties around his operation. She hadn't had a reason to. She had a reason now. She told Caleb that evening what she wanted to do. He was quiet for a moment after she laid it out. They were at the table where they always seemed to be for the serious conversations, with the lamp between them and the cold pressing at the glass. "What are you expecting to find?" he said. "I don't know exactly," she said, and she was honest about that because she'd learned that being honest about uncertainty was better than pretending to more than she had. "But Langford has been in this valley 2 years and he's expanded aggressively in every direction. That kind of expansion, done fast, in a territory where survey records aren't always current, it creates opportunities for errors, or for things that look like errors but aren't." Caleb turned his coffee cup in his hands. Forged boundaries, or adjusted ones, or claims filed on land that was already claimed using descriptions vague enough that someone who doesn't read these things carefully wouldn't catch the overlap. She spread her hands flat on the table. I'm not certain it's there. I'm certain it's worth looking. When? Tomorrow, if the road's passable. He looked at her. I'm coming with you. She started to say it wasn't necessary, and then stopped, because that wasn't the conversation they were supposed to be having anymore. They'd shaken hands on a courthouse step 3 months ago and agreed to be honest with each other about what was needed, and what was needed here was that she not go alone into a situation involving a man who'd already burned their barn. All right, she said. He nodded. He went back to his coffee. Caleb, she said, if I do find something in those records, something significant, it's going to need to go somewhere beyond Boone. We may need a territorial attorney. We don't have money for a territorial attorney. I know that, she said. I'm saying it because I want you to know what we might be heading toward before we head there. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the table. We also don't have money to replace what that barn was worth, he said. So, she agreed. They left the next morning before full light, the wagon moving slow over roads that were passable but only barely, the horse's hooves cracking through the ice skin on the frozen ruts. Evelyn had her satchel and her notes and the particular focused stillness she got when she was about to do something that required precision. Caleb drove and didn't say much, which was normal, but occasionally he looked at her sideways in a way that wasn't surveillance exactly, more like checking that she was still there, which she found she didn't mind. The county office opened at 8. Stills was already behind his desk when they arrived, arranging something with the careful concentration of a man who treated paper organization as a calling. He looked up at Evelyn and then at Caleb with the flicker of recognition that people in small jurisdictions always had. He knew them both by face, if not well by name. Mrs. Mercer, he said, Mr. Mercer, what can I do for you? I need to look at the survey and deed records for the Northern Valley section, Evelyn said. Everything filed in the last 2 years. I'd also like to see the original claim records for the properties bordering Langford Mining's current boundaries. Stills blinked. That's quite a number of documents. I know. I'm sorry to make extra work for you. She meant it sincerely, and something in the way she said it, without impatience, without the entitled briskness that he probably got from men with more power who asked for more things, made him get up from his desk without further comment and lead her back to the records room. Caleb sat in the front room on the bench by the door and waited. He'd offered to help, and she'd told him there was nothing to help with yet. That document reading wasn't a two-person job, and he'd accepted that without making it into anything. She was in the records room for 3 hours. Stills brought her water after the first hour and left her alone after that. She worked through the files systematically, the way her father had taught her. Not looking for any one thing, but reading everything and letting the discrepancies surface. Survey descriptions were written in precise legal language that required you to hold multiple documents in your head simultaneously to understand how their boundaries related to one another. Most people couldn't do this without formal training. She could do it because she'd been doing it since she was a girl and because her mind organized spatial information in the same way it organized numbers, as a system, not a list. She found the first problem 40 minutes in. Langford's original claim, filed 18 months ago, described the eastern boundary of his mining operation using a creek bend as a reference point. The description was standard. Creek bends were common landmarks in territorial surveys. But the creek bend referenced in his filing did not match the creek bend described in the original homestead claim for the property immediately east of his operation, which was a small farm belonging to a family named Pruitt who had left the territory 8 months ago. According to the county records, the Pruitts had sold and moved on. But Langford's survey used the Pruitt property's own boundary marker, as if the eastern limit of his claim began 60 feet further east than the Pruitt deed actually allowed. It was subtle. It was the kind of thing you'd never catch unless you were reading both documents side by side and cross-referencing the creek bend descriptions against the original government survey from 8 years prior. 60 feet in open land meant almost nothing. On a creek property with water access, 60 feet could mean the difference between having riparian rights and not having them. She kept reading. The second problem was larger. Langford had filed an amended survey claim in October, 2 months ago, a month before he'd come to Caleb's property with his polite smile and his practiced warmth. That described the northern boundary of his operation as extending to a ridge line designated in the filing as the Mercer Ridge. The designation appeared to be Langford's own invention. There was no prior survey document in the county records that used that name for any feature in the Northern Valley section. But by naming it and filing a claim that used it as a boundary marker, he had effectively created a paper record suggesting that his operation's northern boundary extended considerably further north than his original claim, specifically far enough north to encompass the South Creek crossing on the Mercer homestead. He hadn't bought the land. He hadn't condemned it. He'd simply filed a document that redrew his boundary to include it, using a landmark name he'd invented himself, in a records office that processed dozens of filings and didn't have the staffing to cross-reference every new description against every existing claim. Evelyn sat very still with the October filing in her hands and the original Mercer deed open on the table beside it, and looked at what she was looking at. He'd done it in October, before he came to visit in December. He'd filed the false boundary claim first, so that when the time came to press harder, there would be a county document, official, stamped, recorded, that could be produced to suggest his operation had a prior claim to the crossing access. Anyone who looked only at the October filing without tracing it back to the original survey records would see something that looked like legitimate documentation. Boone would see it and hesitate. A judge might see it and rule on it before anyone had time to check. It was not sloppy. It was very deliberate, and it was almost clever, and it would have worked, probably, if the person examining the records hadn't known exactly what she was looking for and exactly how to find it. She copied everything. She wrote out both boundary descriptions in full and the original survey description in the Pruitt deed boundary language, and the dates of each filing in her careful handwriting, adding notations that explained in plain language what the discrepancies meant and why they mattered. She worked quickly and without stopping because the light through the records room's single small window told her it was past midday and she'd told Caleb she'd be an hour at most. When she came back into the front room, Caleb was still on the bench. He'd been there 3 hours without complaint, which she registered as something. He looked at her face and stood up immediately. "You found something," he said. "I found several things," she said. "We need to talk, but not here." She thanked Stills with genuine warmth and a specific compliment about his filing organization that made him visibly pleased in the way that people who took quiet pride in quiet work were pleased when someone noticed it. Then they went outside and stood beside the wagon in the January cold, and she told Caleb what she'd found. He listened without interrupting, which was his way. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "He filed a fake boundary claim," he said. "A fraudulent one, yes, using a landmark name that doesn't exist in any prior record. In October, 6 weeks before he came to make us his polite offer." Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. It was a small movement, but she could read him well enough by now to know that it represented a significant amount of contained anger. "He was already planning to take the crossing," he said. "The visit was to see if we'd make it easy for him first. And when we didn't, the barn. And when the barn didn't work, he still had the October filing in his back pocket," she said. "Something to produce when pressure needed to become something official." They stood in the cold looking at each other, and the full shape of what they were dealing with settled between them clearly for the first time. This was not a man who'd gotten frustrated and done something rash. This was a plan, staged and patient, and designed with the understanding that most people gave up before they got to the deeper layers. "We take this to Boone," Caleb said. "Yes. Today. Right now, while we're in town." She was already moving toward the satchel. "But Caleb, I want you to let me present it, not because you're not capable, but because the argument is in the documents, and I know how to walk someone through the documents in a way that makes the conclusion unavoidable." He gave her a look that was dry in the way she'd come to recognize, not offended, just accurate. "I wasn't going to argue about that. I know. I just wanted to say it." "Say it faster next time," he said, and turned toward the wagon. It was the closest thing to a joke he'd made in the entire time she'd known him. She decided not to comment on it. Boone was at his desk when they came in, filling out paperwork with the weary focus of a man who'd been filling out paperwork since before it was light. He looked up and read their faces and set his pen down. "You better sit down," he said, pulling chairs from the wall. Evelyn laid the documents out on his desk in order. Original survey first, then the Pruitt deed, then Langford's original claim, then the October amendment, then her handwritten notes explaining each discrepancy. She took him through it slowly and in sequence, the way you explain something to someone who is intelligent but unfamiliar with the specific language, making each step clear before moving to the next. Boone leaned over the desk and read where she pointed. His expression stayed level throughout, but she watched his eyes and saw the moment he understood what the October filing meant. A small shift, a pause, and then the very deliberate resumption of his neutral expression that told her the pause had meant something. When she was finished, the documents lay spread across his desk, and Boone sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. "He filed this in October," Boone said. "Yes. And the original survey has no reference to a Mercer Ridge anywhere. No reference. The name doesn't appear in any prior document in the county records. He invented a landmark," Caleb said from the chair beside Evelyn, "named it after my property, and used it to extend his boundary claim onto my land without buying it or condemning it." Boone pressed his fingers together and was quiet. "Elias," Caleb said. He rarely used Boone's first name. It changed the register of the conversation. "I've been in this valley 12 years. I've never asked you for anything beyond what's ordinary. I'm asking now." Boone looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the documents again. "I'm going to need to bring in someone from the Territorial Land Office," he said. "This kind of fraudulent filing is above my authority to adjudicate directly. But I can hold the October amendment pending review, and I can do that today." He looked at Evelyn. "Your copies. Are these your handwriting?" "Yes." "Dated and signed." "I'll do it now." She picked up his pen from the desk without asking and dated and signed each page of her notes at the bottom, clearly and in full. "All right," Boone said. He stood up and looked at both of them. "I still need to find the men who set your fire. That's a separate matter from the land fraud, and I want it treated separately so neither case contaminates the other." He paused. "I've had a thought about that. There's a man who came through the valley in November, did some work for Langford's operation, and then moved on. I have reason to think he might still be nearby." "What reason?" Evelyn asked. Boone looked slightly uncomfortable. "He left a horse boarded at the livery and hasn't come back for it. Horse has been there 6 weeks. That either means he ran into trouble or he's somewhere close and doesn't need it." He paused. "I put that together 2 days ago." "What does this man look like?" Caleb said. "Big, heavy set, works with a partner, usually. Smaller man, thin." He looked at Evelyn's notes again. "You mentioned 2 sets of footprints. One set heavier than the other," she said. "The heavier one might be a man named Cord." He said it with the tone of someone who was being careful about what he said next. "If it's Cord, he's done this kind of thing before, which means he's for hire, not for loyalty. Which means he'll talk," Caleb said, "for the right incentive." "That's the hope," Boone said. He found Cord 4 days later, living in a back room above the hardware store at the north end of Silver Ridge, an arrangement that the hardware store owner seemed only dimly aware of. Boone brought a deputy and went up the back stairs early on a Saturday morning when the cold was keeping most people inside. He brought them in without incident, which he attributed to Cord being hungover and his partner being genuinely surprised. Caleb and Evelyn heard about it from young Roy, the same teenage boy who'd served as witness at their wedding in October, who seemed to have an uncanny ability to be present at adjacent moments to all of the valley's significant events. Roy came riding up their path on a Saturday afternoon with the information that Boone had taken 2 men in and that the hardware store owner was very upset about the situation in his back room and that there was a great deal of activity at the sheriff's office. They drove to town on Monday. Boone met them at the door of his office with an expression that was as close to satisfied as Caleb had ever seen on him. "Cord confessed," Boone said simply. "Took most of Saturday night to get there, but he got there. He named who hired him, and he named what he was paid, and he gave me enough to go to the territorial judge with a formal complaint against Langford for the arson and the fraudulent survey filing both." Evelyn let out a breath she'd been holding, she realized, since January. "The Territorial Land Office already has your notes," Boone continued, looking at Evelyn. "They confirmed the October amendment is fraudulent. It'll be struck from the record. The original survey boundaries stand." He paused. "You documented it well. The man I spoke to at the land office said he'd rarely seen someone outside the profession lay it out that clearly. My father taught me to read surveys," she said. "He taught you well," Boone said, with a simple directness that was more meaningful than a longer compliment would have been. Langford was confronted with Cord's confession and the Territorial Land Office's findings on a Wednesday morning, in the presence of Boone and a territorial attorney who'd ridden in from the county seat. What happened behind the closed doors of that meeting, Caleb and Evelyn heard only secondhand, but the secondhand version was consistent across the people who told it. That Langford's attorney had attempted several lines of defense, each of which collapsed against the weight of Evelyn's documented record, and that Langford himself had grown visibly pale over the course of the meeting in the way that men who considered themselves untouchable sometimes did when they discovered they weren't. Victor Langford did not leave the territory immediately. He stayed another 3 weeks, during which time nothing was heard from him officially or unofficially, and then one morning his house in Silver Ridge was found to be emptied and locked, and his operations supervisor announced to the working crew that the northern expansion was suspended indefinitely and most of them were let go. 2 weeks after that, the house went up for sale through a land agent in another county, which was the last formally recorded thing that had Victor Langford's name attached to it in the Silver Ridge Valley. He simply dissolved. The money that had organized itself around him reorganized elsewhere, and the influence that had made the entire community careful about how they spoke near his people went with it. And what was left was just a valley full of homesteaders who slowly, over a few weeks, began to breathe a little more easily in a way they wouldn't have been able to articulate, but that was real and visible in small ways. In the conversations at Harmon's store that got a little louder, in the town meetings that started having more participants, in the way people looked at each other when Langford's name came up, and then gradually stopped looking at each other that way because his name stopped coming up. Caleb heard about his departure from Thomas Aldrich, who came by the property in late February with his 2 sons to help with the barn clearing they'd been postponing since January. They were stacking the usable timber from the ruins when Aldrich mentioned it, casually, the way you mention something everyone already knows. "Heard Langford's gone," Aldrich said. "I heard that," Caleb said. "Heard why too?" Aldrich looked at him sideways without stopping his work. "Heard your wife pulled the ground out from under him with a stack of county documents." "She did," Caleb said. "Smart woman." "I know that," Caleb said. "It came out simpler and more direct than he'd intended, without the qualification he'd normally have added." Aldrich heard it and nodded and went back to stacking timber without making anything of it, which was the right response and which Caleb appreciated. Evelyn was in the cabin when he came in for midday water. She was writing, as she often was. The letter to her mother she wrote each Sunday had moved to sometimes twice a week since January, though she never told Caleb what was in them. He poured water from the jug and set a cup beside her without interrupting, and was almost to the door again when she said his name. He stopped. She wasn't looking up from the page. She was still writing, actually, or had her pen poised above the page in a way that meant she was about to continue. "He's really gone," she said. Not a question. "Sounds like it," he said. She wrote a word, stopped. "I don't feel what I expected to feel." "What did you expect?" "Relief, I suppose, or satisfaction." She set the pen down and looked at the page. "I feel tired." "That's normal," he said. "You've been pushing at something hard for 2 months. When it moves, the pushing stops and you just feel the effort." She looked up at him then, and there was something in her expression that he'd been seeing more of lately. A kind of openness that she hadn't had in October, a slight softening of the very careful self-management she'd walked into his life with. She still managed herself carefully. She just didn't have to do it quite as constantly as she had. "When I walked out here in October," she said, "I told myself I was being practical, that I was doing what had to be done." "You were," he said. "I know." She looked at him steadily. "But I also told myself it would stay practical, that it was safer if it did." He leaned against the door frame and didn't say anything. Outside, he could hear Aldrich's boys working at the burn pile, the thud and crack of timber being moved. "I was probably wrong about that," she said. It was not an easy thing for her to say. He could see that clearly. He looked at her for a long moment across the small room. "Probably," he said. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't resolve anything or name anything or make a promise about what came next. But she nodded slightly, as if it was exactly enough, and picked up her pen again. He went back outside into the cold February air and picked up his end of a heavy beam and helped Thomas Aldrich carry it to the stack, and the work continued the way it always did. Imperfect, necessary, and quietly held together by the kind of trust that doesn't get built in a day or declared in a speech, but accumulated slowly in the long hours of ordinary difficult life, shared honestly between two people who'd chosen, against considerable odds and with no guarantee of anything, to stand in the same place when it mattered. March came in the way March always did in that part of Montana, badly. 2 weeks of false thaw followed by a hard freeze that turned everything that had started to drip and soften back into ice overnight, so that the yard was a sheet of it by morning and the animals had to be led carefully on the way to water. Then a week of snow that wasn't the heavy, dramatic snow of January, but the mean, wet, exhausting kind that sat on every surface and soaked through anything that wasn't properly weatherproofed and made every outdoor task twice as miserable as it needed to be. Caleb rebuilt the barn in this, not alone. Aldrich came back twice with his boys, and the Pruitt family from the south end of the valley sent their oldest son for a week because, as old Pruitt put it when he stopped by with the boy, "You helped us move fence last summer, and a man doesn't forget that." Caleb hadn't remembered the fence. He'd done it in an afternoon and thought nothing of it. The fact that Pruitt had kept the account and paid it now, in labor, in the worst building weather of the year, said something about the kind of exchange system that existed in the valley between people who had nothing to spare, and therefore kept very careful track of what they owed each other. Evelyn fed whoever showed up. This was not a small thing given the state of their stores after a hard winter, but she managed it the way she managed everything, by understanding exactly what she had and working within it precisely. She made food that stretched without being obviously stretched, the kind of cooking that requires more skill than abundance. And nobody went home hungry, which in February in Montana was an achievement worth noting. The new barn went up slower than Caleb wanted and faster than he'd feared. The frame was rougher than the original in places. He ran short on the right gauge lumber in the third week and had to adapt with what he could source locally, and there was a section of the south wall that sat slightly off true that he'd have to address in spring. It wasn't beautiful, it was functional and solid, and it stood, which was what mattered. The morning they raised the last wall section, Evelyn came out of the cabin with 2 cups of coffee and stood beside Caleb while he looked at it. It was a cold, clear morning, the sky, the hard, bright blue that sometimes appeared between March storms, like a reminder that other kinds of days existed. "It's not as tall as the old one," she said. "No," he agreed. "But the old one had a weak joint in the northeast corner that I always knew about and never fixed. This one doesn't have that." She looked at him sideways. "You never mentioned the weak joint." "It wasn't a problem until it was." She considered that. "I suppose that's true of a lot of things." He drank his coffee. The barn stood in the early light, rough and new and slightly imperfect, and he felt about it the way he sometimes felt about things that had required more from him than he'd thought he had. Not pride exactly, because pride was too clean an emotion for what it had taken to get here. Something more complicated than pride. Something that included the fire and the cold and Evelyn on the bucket line with her arms giving out and still not stopping, and Aldrich appearing in the dark without being called, and the long hours at the kitchen table going through documents, and all the smaller moments between those that didn't make for good stories, but were the actual substance of what the winter had been. "We're going to need to think about the East Slope soon," Evelyn said. "If we want to try the winter rye variety from your father's—" "From the catalog," she corrected quietly. "We need to prep the soil before the last frost." "I know," he said. "I've been thinking about the drainage on the upper section. If we cut a channel along the north edge, it'll move the meltwater off faster, and we won't lose the first 2 weeks of the season to waterlogged ground the way I did last year." She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her coat pocket. She always had it, he'd noticed, the way some people always had a knife, and wrote something. "How long to cut the channel?" 4 days if the ground cooperates. 6 if it doesn't." "Add it to the April plan," she said. "I'll calculate what the additional yield from the east slope could mean for the fall market against the cost of the channel work." He looked at her. "You're already planning the fall market. We need to." She closed the notebook. "Caleb, we lost 6 weeks of productive time to Langford's situation and the fire. We rebuilt the barn, but we drew down the repair reserves to do it. If this growing season doesn't perform well, we go into next winter with less margin than I'd like." She paused. "I'm not saying this to worry you. I'm saying it because we need to plan carefully, and I want to do that together." He was quiet for a moment. He appreciated that she'd said together, and he appreciated that she'd said it without making anything of saying it, just used it as the ordinary word it was. The east slope yield could be significant, he said, if the rye takes. I think it will take. She looked at the slope in question, the long rise of the eastern field beyond the yard, still snow-covered, but with the suggestion of the soil's contour visible underneath. The composition is right. I've been reading about it, and I'm reasonably confident. Reasonably, he said. I don't say certain about things I can't be certain about, she said, but reasonably confident is good enough to act on. He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. In the way he almost did things sometimes. You could see the edge of it without the full thing arriving. All right, he said. April. The channel first, then the planting. She nodded, and they stood there a moment longer looking at the barn, the valley, the hard blue sky. Then she went back inside to start breakfast, and he went to check on the horses, and the morning moved forward the way mornings did. Spring arrived unevenly and without apology, the way it always did in that country, taking its time and offering no guarantees. The snow came off the fields in patches rather than all at once, leaving behind the dark, wet earth that was the valley's real promise. Heavy soil, rich with the mineral wash of the mountains, the kind of ground that rewarded patience and punished neglect. Caleb cut the drainage channel on the east slope in 5 days, which was better than his pessimistic estimate and worse than his optimistic one, which he took as a sign that his judgment was calibrated approximately correctly. Evelyn planted the winter rye. She did it methodically and in sections, the way she did everything, recording each section's planting date and seed density in the notebook, so that if one section performed differently from another, she'd be able to trace the reason. Caleb watched her do this on the first real planting day of spring, the ground finally soft enough to work, the air still cold but no longer hostile, and thought about the woman who'd walked 8 miles through frozen mud to propose a business arrangement to a stranger, and thought about how that woman was the same woman on her knees in the turned earth with her notebook beside her, doing work that would not show results for months, and approaching it with the same precision she brought to the county records. He'd loved Margaret. He wanted to be honest with himself about that, because Margaret deserved the honesty, and he'd spent 3 years being honest about her absence without always being honest about what it had taken from him. He'd loved her completely, and losing her had damaged something in him that he'd assumed, quietly, in the way you assume things you never examine out loud, was simply permanent damage, the kind that heals over on the surface and stays broken underneath. He was starting to think he'd been wrong about that, not in any dramatic way, not in the way of stories where a person suddenly realizes something and everything shifts at once. It was more like the drainage channel. You cut the path and then the water finds it, gradually, and the ground that was waterlogged starts to drain. And one day you notice the upper section is drier than it used to be, but you couldn't say exactly when that changed. He didn't say any of this to Evelyn, not yet. He was still finding the words for it, or perhaps more accurately, he was still deciding whether words were necessary at all, given that everything between them seemed to communicate itself through the texture of daily life rather than through declarations, through coffee cups placed without asking, through notebooks pulled out at exactly the right moment, through someone moving the lamp to your side of the table because the light is better there and you shouldn't have to ask. What he did say, one evening in early April, when the days had gotten long enough that they could sit on the porch after dinner without freezing, was something smaller that carried some of the weight of the larger thing. They were watching the valley go gold in the late light, the way it did in April evenings when the sun came off the mountains at the right angle. Evelyn had her notebook but wasn't writing in it. He had his coffee. It was quiet in the good way that quiet could be when there were 2 people in it. "You should write to your mother about the east slope," he said. "What we're trying this year." She looked at him. "Why?" "Because she worries about whether you made the right decision," he said, "coming here. And the east slope is something to tell her." Evelyn was very still for a moment. "She told you that? That she worries?" "She didn't have to tell me. She looks at you when she visits the same way you look at a fence line you're not sure will hold." He looked at his coffee cup. "I notice things. I just don't always say them." "I've noticed that about you," she said. "Tell her about the slope," he said. "Tell her we think it'll yield well, and that we have a plan for the fall market. Give her something concrete. She'll sleep better." Evelyn looked at the valley for a moment. "All right," she said quietly. There was a pause. "Caleb," she said. I don't She stopped and started again, which she almost never did. Evelyn Carter, Evelyn Mercer, was a woman who generally knew what she meant to say before she started saying it. I don't regret it. I want you to know that, in case you've wondered. He'd wondered. He wasn't going to lie and say he hadn't. You don't share a small cabin through the hardest winter of recent memory with a person without occasionally asking yourself, in the dark, what that person actually thought of the life they'd ended up in. I'm glad, he said simply. I came here for practical reasons, she said. I want to be clear that I know that. I'm not pretending it was something else. I know what it was. But it became... She stopped again, looked at her hands. Something different, and I didn't plan for that. No, he said. Neither did I. She looked at him then, directly, with those gray eyes that had never once flinched from anything that needed looking at. The evening light caught the angles of her face, still sharp, still tired in the underlying way that a hard winter leaves people tired, but different from October in a way that went beyond the obvious. Less armored, maybe. Not defenseless. Evelyn Mercer was never going to be defenseless. But something in the careful, constant self-management had relaxed in the way of something that no longer needed to work that hard. What do we do about it? She asked. It was, he thought, the most practical way anyone had ever opened that particular conversation. I suppose we keep doing what we're doing, he said, and stop pretending it's only practical. She was quiet for a moment. Then something happened on her face that he'd seen only a few times. A full, unguarded expression, not managed, not constructed. It wasn't quite a smile. It was closer to relief, the specific relief of something you've been carrying a long way finally being set down. That seems reasonable, she said. You told me once that reasonable confidence was good enough to act on, he said. She looked at him. I said that about rye grain. Still applies? She actually laughed then. Not the small controlled sounds she sometimes made at things that were mildly funny, but a real one. Brief and surprised, the kind that comes when something catches you before you can curate your reaction. He heard it and stored it away in the category of things he hadn't known he needed. The east slope performed beyond what either of them had projected. The winter rye came in strong, and even in early summer, the drainage channel doing exactly what Caleb had designed it to do, moving the spring melt efficiently enough that the seedlings had gotten strong root purchase before the ground dried. Evelyn's section-by-section planting record showed that the northwest quadrant had slightly higher density than the others due to a difference in seed spacing she'd noted and adjusted for, which meant next year's planting would be even better. By late summer, they were looking at a yield that was nearly double what the east slope had ever produced under Caleb's management, which said less about his former ability than about what happened when good soil got the right attention and someone with Evelyn's systematic patience tracked every variable. He wasn't too proud to acknowledge that. He'd been farming this land for years and doing it adequately, and she'd come in with a notebook and a different way of looking at things and improved it substantially, and the only honest response to that was to recognize it for what it was. The harvest that fall was genuinely good, not miraculous. The Westfield had an aphid problem in August that cost them 20% of that section's grain, and one of the cattle went lame in September and required expensive treatment that pushed their reserves thinner than Evelyn liked. But net good, measurably above the previous year, enough that they entered the fall with a surplus they hadn't had before. Evelyn proposed giving a portion of it away. She brought it up at the table in October, nearly 1 year, almost to the week, since she'd first sat across from him there with her satchel and her documents and her proposal. The Hendersons, a family that had settled the northeast corner of the valley in the spring and had a difficult first season with poor timing on their planting and an early blight that took most of their vegetable garden, were going to be short through the winter. We have enough, she said, Shaz, not extravagantly, but enough. They don't. He looked at her across the table. How much? Enough grain to get them through March if they're careful. I've calculated it. We can spare it without putting ourselves short. You're sure about the calculation? She gave him a look. Right, he said. Of course you are. I also thought, she said, that if we brought it over ourselves rather than sending it through intermediaries, it would be better. They're new here. They don't know anyone well. Starting a winter not knowing your neighbors is harder than it needs to be. He thought about his own winters of not knowing anyone, of the silence that had weight and texture, of how long it had taken for the distance between himself and the rest of the valley to become something he'd stopped noticing because it felt normal, and how wrong that had been without him realizing it. "When?" he said. "Sunday," she said. "I already baked." He didn't ask what she'd baked or when she'd found the time. He just nodded. They drove to the Henderson place on Sunday with grain in the wagon bed and a covered basket on the seat between them. The Hendersons, young couple, not much past 20, with an infant and an expression of people who had been pretending harder than was sustainable for several months, opened the door and looked at the wagon with the complicated expression of people who needed help and hadn't yet learned to receive it without the help feeling like a verdict on them. Evelyn got down from the wagon and said, "We're your neighbors from the South property. I'm Evelyn Mercer, and this is Caleb. We've been meaning to come by since spring and kept not managing it, which is our fault, and we're sorry for it." She held out the basket. "I made too much cornbread, and if you don't take some of it, I'll be irritated about the waste." It was the exact right thing to say. Not charity, not pity. An inconvenience she was asking them to solve for her. The young woman, her name was Clara, took the basket and her face did the thing faces do when tension releases suddenly, a slight collapse of the careful structure she'd been maintaining. "Come in," Clara said. "Please." They stayed 2 hours. Caleb and the young husband, Daniel Henderson, talked about the Northeast soil and what had gone wrong with the planting and what to do differently in the spring, which was the conversation Daniel needed to have with someone who wasn't going to judge him for the mistakes he'd made in ignorance. Evelyn and Clara talked about things Caleb couldn't fully hear from across the room, but he noticed Clara laugh twice and sit up straighter by the time the visit was over. When they unloaded the grain before leaving, Daniel looked at it and then at Caleb with the expression of someone building up to something. "We can't," he started. "You can," Caleb said, "and you'll pass it forward when you're on your feet and someone else needs it. That's how it works out here." Daniel nodded slowly and said nothing else about it, which was the right response, and they shook hands on it. On the drive home, Evelyn sat with her hands in her lap and the empty basket at her feet and didn't say anything for a while. The valley was gold and orange in the October evening, the aspens finally turning after holding their leaves longer than usual this year, and the mountains to the west were doing what they always did in October evenings, going purple and enormous against a sky that was more color than air. "They'll be all right," she said finally. "Not a question. If they're careful and they get a fair spring," Caleb said. "Yeah, I think so." "They reminded me of us," she said. "A little." He thought about that. Two people trying to hold something together under conditions that weren't asking for their convenience, starting from a position of needing more than they had, and figuring it out mostly by not quitting. "A little," he agreed. She leaned slightly against his shoulder. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just a small shift of weight in his direction, the kind of movement that meant something because it was so ordinary. He didn't move away. He kept driving. The aspens went past them in the evening light, thin and gold, rattling slightly in the wind that was coming off the mountains with the first real suggestion of the winter behind it. Another winter. The third one this land had seen with Caleb Mercer on it, the first with Evelyn Mercer beside him, and he found when he thought about the cold months ahead that he didn't feel the way he used to feel in October. That particular wait, the press of the long silence coming. He felt something more like readiness. Not eager, exactly. Just prepared. The barn was solid. The stores were sound. The books were in order. And he wasn't going into it alone. That was not a small thing. He understood now that he'd been telling himself it was a small thing for 3 years because the alternative was feeling how large it actually was, and he hadn't been ready for that. You could lose something enormous and survive it and still be walking around with the shape of what you'd lost pressing against you from the inside. And after long enough, you stopped noticing the pressure the way you stopped noticing the draft under a door. Not because it was gone, but because you'd made yourself used to it. He wasn't used to it anymore. He felt the difference in the particular way you feel a wound that's been healing correctly. Not the pain of the injury, but the new tenderness of new tissue, the specific sensitivity of something that is genuinely repairing itself. They got home when the light was almost gone. Evelyn went inside to start dinner, and Caleb unhitched the horse and put the wagon away, and checked the barn the way he checked it every evening. Latches, feed, water, the quiet inventory of the things that were his responsibility, and that he took seriously as such. The barn smelled like new timber still, 8 months after the rebuilding, under the familiar overlay of hay and animal and cold. He stood in it for a moment before going in, listening to the horses shift and settle, the wind picking up outside and the structure holding against it the way a structure is supposed to hold. He'd built this one better than the first. Not perfectly. That section of the south wall still sat slightly off true, and he'd need to address it in spring, and there was a beam in the northeast corner he wasn't fully confident about. But better than what it replaced. Strengthened specifically at the places where the original had been weak. That seemed like the right way to rebuild things. Not identical to what was lost. Better, in the particular ways that loss had taught you to be better. He went inside. Evelyn was at the stove and the cabin was warm, and something was already smelling like food. She didn't look up when he came in, but she said, "It'll be 20 minutes," which was the most domestic sentence he could imagine, and which landed in the room with the comfortable weight of ordinary life. He sat at the table and pulled the spring planning ledger toward him. There was work to plan. The channel maintenance, the east slope seeding schedule for next year, the decision about whether to add another head of cattle before the summer market. Real decisions about a real future, the kind you only make when you believe there's going to be one worth making decisions about. He opened the ledger and picked up the pen and started writing, and behind him Evelyn moved around the stove in the particular rhythm that was hers, and the fire put out its steady heat, and outside the Montana dark came down over the valley the way it always did. Immense, indifferent, total. And inside the small cabin on the plateau, there were two people who had chosen each other from necessity and stayed from something better. And the lamp burned between them, and the work went on, and that was enough. Not a fairy tale, not a tragedy, just two imperfect people, one difficult year and the stubborn human insistence on building something real from whatever you're given. That has always been the story worth telling.